Right. Let's begin with a word of prayer. We do thank you, God, that you hold the world in your hands, that the nature of what we come to do is to live in awe of the majesty and wonder of all you create. And you gave T.F. Torrance eyes to see and ears to hear what it means to see the world you create with wonder, but also with delving into the wonder of all the different things the sciences explore. So may you give us exploratory minds open to what T.F. Torrance was able to see in clarifying what it means to know you and to know your world. So I pray you'd bless Kerry and bless our conversation and all those who hear in the future. May you hold us in your hands, guide us into where we need to go. We pray this in your name, you who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
So again, we are moving on. For those of you who are getting this recorded, a second section within chapter 6 of Theological Science, and Theological Science chapter 6 has subdivisions in it. The comparison of the sciences, theological versus the others. Last week we particularly looked at similarities, and today we're looking at differences. So Kerry is going to once again bring his masterful insight into these subjects
Thank you,
and
Marty,
help,
for
help us
inviting
to
me.
get objectivity and subjectivity and all that, and how it helps us to clarify what's going on. So,
It is a privilege and an honor to be invited. So thank you for inviting me. And Bruce, Bill, and Ted, great to have you join us. Thank you. Please jump in anytime as we go. It will be better for your input also.
so you begin with just a note here. You've got the same dots in the column, and again, this is page 4 of last week's handout. And each
Right.
one of those dots to the left represents a paragraph within the text of theological science. So it's helpful sometimes just to recognize, to move along with those dots, to recognize there's an order to what it is that we're doing here, as well as pages that you have in there that are covered by those paragraphs.
I was hoping this format might be helpful to have beside one while reading now or
Yes,
in the future. So that I don't,
yes.
that was my intent.
And it works wonderfully for that. So you begin with a quote: in spite of the overlap of concepts that they may evolve, it is scientific to force the application of concepts from one field of investigation into another where they do not belong. So we're talking about the distinctions in what Torrance has described as all these different sciences, that there's some things that hold them together. And today we're going to be looking at how we recognize that just because they're different, that doesn't mean that there isn't a conversation. That we might say the study of science is a community with distinctions. Is that?
Yeah, that's great. And that quote is a wonderful explanation of what I would use the word scientism to refer to. To me, scientism is when any field of science is imperialistic in trying to just force the application of its concepts directly into another field that might not be appropriate for that field. And so so that it, Torrance is articulating that very clearly here.
Yeah.
Hey,
And of
Ken,
course,
glad you could join us. Good to see you.
for my purposes, to say that what has been largely seen as the science of the impersonal, the physical world that doesn't include the personal, has been one of my concerns about that very kind of dominance of one that cannot hear the other, that I'm trying to find through Torrance and Karl Barth and others, to find, how do we acknowledge the value of the science of the personal? And this point is certainly at stake here.
Oh, Marty, that's a perfect example of scientism where the personal is involved. That can be so easily disregarded in cases of scientism.
Touch-free with a spot-free rinse. There aren't any brushes inside the wash, so you won't need that.
Somebody's getting their
Let's
car
see.
washed.
We'll wash the entire thing.
That must
Works,
be Todd.
big press, and
Oops,
save.
oops.
There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Right.
So So you have some questions under it. Can you think of examples where there was an illegitimate transfer of concepts or principles from one science to another when the source or receiving science was theology? In other words, theology was the one dominating, when neither science was theology, and we may call this illegitimate incursion of one science into the domain of other scientism. So I wanted to see if anybody had examples of that came to mind as you read this. Bill, I see that hand.
Social Darwinism.
Uh-huh. And what do
Uh-huh.
you see what do you see encouraging onto another?
Biology into sociology.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Darwin himself really rejected Herbert Spencer's use of the term survival of the fittest when
Hmm.
applied to society. Now, his cousin Francis Galton was a developer of eugenics, but Darwin was really not impressed by Spencer's application of natural selection to social questions.
Which it was interesting to hear that Darwin was a geologist first before he did what we think of him as simply being, dealing with the biological sciences and so forth.
Yeah, his first four books, three of them were works in geology, and that's where his heart was at first. You know, geology provides a good example. One of my a classic study, a short little book that would really illuminate this question of the illegitimate transfer of concepts is it's old, but it's worth reading. Truly a classic. Joe Birchfield, Lord Kelvin and the Age of the Earth. And it's just a tiny little study of how Kelvin used the principles of physics as he understood them at the time to try to refute the geologist's account of erosion of the superficial uh, strata across England, often called the denudation of the Weald. And and Kelvin pitted the certain conclusions of physics, disproved all those unspecifiable hunches of the geologists, and then it turned out that the physics was in error. The
Mhm.
geologists had methods that were just their competence was completely underestimated by Kelvin's misplaced confidence in the application of physics. That's an example of scientism where it's one scientific discipline illegitimately applying its methods, transferring them into the other science without an equal competence in the other science. And of course, it can happen with theology involved also. I think, for example, of how about when I was young, I remember reading um, works by the young Earth creationist Henry Morris. And I remember very well how he made a lot of mileage out of the estimation that the number of the grains of sand, according to modern science, is of the same order of magnitude as the number of known stars in the heavens. And that was how he exegeted the passage in Genesis where God says to Abraham, your descendants will be like the grains of sand and the stars in the sky. And so that desire to apply that on an informational level, as though the modern science should match that as a conclusion of scientific investigation in geology and astronomy, that should match the text of Scripture without regard to whether that's what the language of Scripture really was intended to teach us or not. That would be another example where we might say theology or biblical hermeneutics was the source of the illegitimate transfer. An
Not to
example of
mention just the opening of Genesis, the chapters necessarily being ages or days or anything like that.
yeah, yeah, there we go. You know, and another work from back in those days that struck me at the time was Cosmos. I remember when Cosmos was published by Carl Sagan and the book
Yeah.
form and the movies. And the very first sentence of the book, here's this Cornell astronomer, all the authority of astronomy, and he says the first sentence is the cosmos is all there ever was, is, or shall be, as if that's where astronomy starts. Well, I think that's an example of incursion into theology of a natural
Mhm.
science as well. So, so this crossing disciplinary boundaries without regard for what's cataphysin within each discipline, it happens in all kinds of ways.
Did you want to say something, Ken?
Yeah, I mean in the field of paleontology, and I can't remember the gentleman who taught at Harvard. Um, I read a couple of his books because my pastor friend said read this.
Stephen Jay
And
Gould, perhaps?
right, exactly. Thank you. And I read these and I said, come on. Of course, he's a Yankees fan, which didn't go with me. But anyways, besides that, this gentleman was really crossing the line, making comments that he was out of his, oof. Okay. Um, I am, and I put in the chat, Francis Collins of the Genome Project and the National Institutes of Health. He's my homeboy. There is a man who was a great, he came from atheism to a strong Christian faith, and he can balance those. He sees no contradiction between them. And to me, that's the model. One other person, and I'll stop, that doesn't get the credit. Benjamin Warfield. And I mean, Ken down there, and Marty and I were at Princeton Seminary. Benjamin Warfield wrote a defense of Darwin. And that got lost in the sauce because Charles Hodge, who had influence over the fundamentalists, was the whatever. But Benjamin Warfield said there's no contradiction. If we believe in the sovereignty of God, God can do whatever God wants to do. So there.
Okay.
It can. I really appreciate both of those examples. And if you don't mind, I'll elaborate just a little bit on them.
Yes.
We could talk for hours about Francis Collins. I would really enjoy having pizza with you and doing that. Um,
Yeah.
for anyone
Where do you live, Kerry? I don't know you. I apologize. Where are
oh,
you
that's
from?
okay. I live in Norman, Oklahoma, but I do get around. Where are you?
I'm in Edison, New Jersey.
I was in New
And
Jersey 3 weeks ago.
okay,
So,
I live 22 miles from Princeton, and
okay.
Marty Folsom and Ken Ross and I just did a conference about Karl Barth and incarcerated. So Marty is
Oh,
a pilgrim
fantastic.
down here, and Ken and I have been Philadelphia buds for 1,000 years.
All right. That's wonderful. And I was in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago too. Ken, is that where you are?
Yes.
All right. Wow. I'll be back in December, I think.
Okay, Philadelphia for me is the promised land.
Okay.
I'm from West Philadelphia. Yes, Will Smith grew up near me, but
And
I didn't know him.
and I might just mention that Philadelphia happens to have a Norman, Oklahoma football player as the Super Bowl champion quarterback. Just saying. But
Oh,
uh,
Jalen Hurts is
Jalen
from
Hurts.
Norman, Oklahoma.
Yeah, he
University
was
of Oklahoma.
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so I'm
Sharing
at
the
the
wealth.
University of Oklahoma. But quickly, I just encourage anyone who is interested in the disciplinary relations of science and theology to watch the entire Templeton Awards ceremony when Francis Collins received the Templeton Award, which is always it's a Lifetime Achievement Award for science and theology. Thomas F. Torrance was the first recipient of it when it was designated for science and theology, persuading the Templeton Foundation to which already had the award, but from that point on to turn it to science and religion. That's a TF event. Collins received it the year of the pandemic, and the interaction that he has with N.T. Wright and with others on the program is a marvelous example of dialogue between science and religion with mutual respect for disciplinary expertise. So just throw that out. Many people
Yeah.
here would know of the Templeton and Wright, and that's a wonderful way in to begin to appreciate
Yeah.
Collins.
I'm an NT Wright fan.
Mhm. Uh, Another thing on the Hodge and Warfield, Warfield was reading Darwin long before the origin. Warfield followed Darwin, as did so many people who were scientifically aware at the time. And yes, throughout his life, all the way to the end, he insisted that Darwin himself, that the views in the origin could be held. It matters how they're held, and with no conflict to Christian faith or to the interpretation of Scripture. On Charles Hodge, the What is Darwinism book that came out, I do think there is an influence of Warfield there, because Hodge says his conclusion, often exaggerated, misquoted, is that Darwinism, the Darwin of the origin, would be acceptable. The only thing that he was objecting to was Darwin's explicit rejection of Asa Gray's providential view of natural selection, which Darwin announced in the closing pages of The Domestication of Plants and Animals. I'm sorry, The Variation of Plants and Animals Under Domestication. That book, not The Origin, is what prompted Hodge's statement. No, we have to remember the doctrine of providence, of particular providence, and if we assert that, then we're not going to find an objection. One of the people that Hodge influenced, who contributed to the fundamentals, was George Frederick Wright, a pastor and a geologist, one of the early American geologists, and he contributed an essay to the fundamentals. But in the 1870s, the latter part of the 1870s, he contributed a five-part article series to Bibliotheca Sacra, the journal put out by Princeton Seminary, that was one of the best read periodicals among clergy in the entire U.S., not just Presbyterians. And Wright argued in along similar lines as Warfield and Hodge that Darwinism was a providential, or in his phrase, Calvinist view of the history of life.
Hmm.
And so all three of those figures do represent voices from a reformed and even evangelical perspective in America that showed a response to evolutionary thinking that was quite different than I think what most people today imagine, having grown up since the 50s with young Earth creationism. Young Earth flood geology was quite rare in the 19th century. It was an anomaly, not a norm.
Hmm.
So we could talk about all those topics on their own, Ken, but I just thought I'd throw those
Yeah.
in response to your great comments.
So one comment that J.B. Torrance made is not academic science, but to say the history of what is called the orders of creation is a reading of the nature of, it seems that God has made men stronger than women, and certain races that were, the word race is used and then placed hierarchically. That's a kind of maybe a popular science level that's reading off, but it functions as though it is science and becomes something that dominates over and sets up for all kinds of things that God intends for these kinds of hierarchical relationships and all that.
Yes. I feel like it's a pretty convincing historical pattern that when natural theology is elevated, that very quickly there's oppression. It leads to eugenics and to oppression of those who are disabled, and it leads to ethnic and national conflicts. It, that's all growing from the roots, not of, say, some scientific theory about the
Yeah.
origin of life. That's growing from saying our starting place is we look at nature to do the
Mhm.
job for us of theology.
Yeah.
It starts from a classical natural theology
Yeah.
and very quickly can have terrible
Yes.
expressions in our culture.
The first speaker on Sunday evening in the conference we were just in said, people asking me what my definition of, oh, where does that word go away? Of discrimination. I say discrimination in one word is ignorance, right? It's not knowing. I mean, what you just explained there is the people who don't have the ability to see the world in such a way where they're not appropriately engaging the nature of things in respectful kind of way. So it's simply a not knowing that leaves us vulnerable to what you just talked about, all of the abuses of it then. So again, just to say the value of education, the value of the sciences is that it does give us a world submitted to the reality of that which we engage. Firstly, the personhood of God, and then it allows us to see the world in a particular kind of way. And Darwin, when seen appropriately, is living into that seeing and understanding without the incursion being present. The word incursion, of course, I use the word recursion all the time, which recursion is to reoccur in the seeing and being seen and all that. Incursion, what would be a word that you use as to what incursion means?
Hegemony, perhaps,
Okay.
uh, imperialism. It's intellectual imperialism.
Okay.
Um, um, how about um, I mean, this is really oversimplified, but the sum of all the angles in a triangle is 180 degrees, right? It's been
Okay.
a long time since I've had geometry, but but suppose one would just apply that to rectangles. It wouldn't work. Uh, what's true for triangles doesn't apply to rectangles.
Mhm.
Um, and it's the same kind of problem when one is applying conclusions from one science into another. Those conclusions have to be developed cataphysin within each science. That's
Mhm.
why for a millennium, arithmetic and geometry had to have their proofs separate. If you had a proof of a principle in arithmetic, you couldn't just say that applies to magnitudes, which is what geometry studies. You had to also prove it on its own grounds in geometry, but it was expected you'd be able to make that proof. But but since arithmetic dealt with numbers, geometry with magnitudes, those are not the same thing. You must not just transfer without thought from one to another.
Mhm.
And then I think it's helpful to take an example like that where after Descartes and developments in mathematics in the early modern period, arithmetic and geometry were integrated. Um, let's remember that scientific disciplines are always changing. So
Mhm.
that's one of the things we can be alert to
Mhm.
is that think of the inexhaustibility of the richness of creation as a braided stream, and so it's not set in stone exactly what the relations between the disciplines will be.
Mhm.
But as we are beginning to understand each aspect of creation on its own ground as it's disclosed to us, we need to be alert to how not to keep transferring over to it um, um, ideas that might have seemed legitimate in a previous configuration. But
Mhm.
the more we know now, the more we realize, no, we'd better reestablish that point on this new ground that
Mhm.
is emerging for us.
Very good. So I just want to point in the structure of your handout, we're moving into the italicized objectivity, which is going to go from pages 295 to 303 in the book. And then you, on page 5, you have subjectivity, which goes from 303 to 312. So it divides the sections we're looking at today. But this is within a section that is framing a conversation around differences between theology and the other sciences. So it's not just a general definition of these distinctions, as though we're just starting to talk about knowledge. He's wanting to help us to understand how we see differences in a way that's true to the nature of our investigation. Can you just comment on the particular use of these distinguishing features here as he moves into the section?
On the distinguishing features of, I
Well,
guess I lost.
I mean, the fact that at this point you were here in chapter 6, almost at the end of the book, and now he's using objectivity and subjectivity to help us to focus in on how we live within the respectful place of the differences of theology and the other sciences, and maybe even the sciences between themselves. So, what is the particular value of using those terms at this point to help us see what it is we need to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I do think this whole chapter in plays kind of a summing up role for the book. There's a lot of recapitulation going on. So everything that you've talked about already, is alluded to and applies.
Mhm.
But one of the overwhelming take-home points that I discern from this chapter is that a devotion to the sciences, whether it's theological science or some form of natural science or human science, any pursuit of work in a scientific field throughout one's life is honored as a form of spiritual formation.
Mhm.
And the objectivity side gets the discipline of that. And that we are to be disciplined, as we saw last week, to always have the center in the object that we're trying to know, not just the center in ourselves, not just approach the science as self-projection, but to be completely devoted to the progressive disclosure of the reality that we're investigating.
Mhm.
So that's the objectivity. And on the other side, the subjectivity, the personal nature that this growth in spiritual formation that the pursuit of any science affords us is ineradicably personal for us.
Mhm.
Where we are to conform ourselves to reality, not expect reality to conform itself to us.
Mhm.
So so objectivity and subjectivity seem to play together in his account of all of the sciences, just as they do for me in thinking about spiritual formation. And I do believe it in a culture where churches are being faithful and effective, that young people will grow up seeing pursuit of any science, theological science, natural science, human science, pursuit of any science as a religious pursuit
Mhm.
of a divine calling.
Mhm. Very good. Ken, I see that hand.
Okay. I will confess, I don't have a copy of Theological Science, but I have Ground and Grammar of Theology.
Mhm.
That's a later work than Theological Science. If so, are the basic premises in Theological Science in Ground and Grammar of Theology?
I would say theological science is much more dense, much more careful. It's a written exposition. Ground and grammar were originated in lectures, oral talks. And so there's a difference in the density and the fine textured development that can be done in theological science. Ground and grammar is a great intro and survey, and then to plunge into the detailed, comprehensive, rigorous development of those same themes read Theological Science. Ground and
Okay.
Grammar, Chapter 4 on the transformation of natural theology or natural theology. That chapter in particular, I think, covers some of the same issues discussed in this chapter on the relations between the sciences.
Okay.
There's a quick response. Marty, you want to?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the word object, to recognize that in the Latin, it's, to stand over against reality is not a resistance to reality. It's just to recognize there is something I am coming that is other than myself to know and understand. And it's not necessarily impersonal. The nature of that which is objective can be personal, i.e., the God who speaks. So I think just to pay attention to that, and then subject, that there is a understanding under, subjecting, a placing ourselves under the wisdom of that which is other than ourselves, that allows our thinking and being to be taught at some level, so that we are subjective by virtue of a careful receptivity to that which is other, which is to say that's kataphusin, right? We're allowing ourselves to be taught by the other and to form our thought process. But by virtue of being subjective, it's not concrete, it's not another concrete. It is the heuristic learning process that is an appropriate, teachable kind of subjectivity.
Well said. That's helpful, Marty.
So then looking at your first point there, in all the sciences, we refer our thought to what is external to ourselves and are devoted to objectivity. And so you've got a point there that you're making on that. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, all that you've talked about earlier in the book about semantic realism would be my term for it, that a realistic approach in any science is not getting stuck in the proper formulations, the words or the equations, whatever represents reality, but actually in thinking about the reality. In the sciences, we're not just thinking about the universe, we're thinking the universe, thinking the order. We're not just talking about God, we're thinking of God. We're not mistaking our understanding of the wording of Scripture with knowing the living word. So, so, so we talked last week, or how this chapter opened with Torrance's traditional way of putting it. We're pursuing a center in the reality being studied, not a center in ourselves. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it.
And the nature of the quote there, rigorous formulations of our knowledge are not to be treated like transcripts of reality. I think there's an interesting thought there of, what is it that we think a transcript does? I mean, we do that with Zoom. You can go on, right? And the posts on YouTube, you can get a transcript. But to say there's something missing if we do that, right?
Yeah, think of it in a courtroom, how the transcribed um, uh, version is going to be the basis for the decisions that come down. And yet, if we have that attitude toward toward knowledge in any science, we're not going to make any major creative advances in that field.
Yeah.
We're going to be having an attitude toward the knowledge of the field that is increasingly abstracted from the reality that we're trying to connect with. So to actually make contact with reality, we see all those transcripts of reality as witnesses and pointers to the reality. Very helpful. I recite the Apostles' Creed every morning. I'm so
Huh.
glad for it. But I don't mistake the wording of that creed for the reality that I am worshiping when I recite it.
Yeah. And when people say, do you know this person or that person? I say, I know their name and I've met them once. I don't want to say that I know them because I haven't had the appropriate time to feel like there is this respectful, mutual kind of knowing where I'd say, yes, I do know that person, right? And I think,
Exactly. Yes, to be invited into someone's home, have a meal with them in a pub, that's a completely different thing than having read their book or
yeah,
just talk to them very briefly. Yeah.
And he will later on in our section today talk about the difference between knowing about
Yeah.
versus the knowing in a personal kind of way. So the ability in objectivity does not mean that it's not revisable, that's part of the ongoing thing. Is to be objective is to continue to learn based on the growing understanding we have, which again, the scablands of Eastern Washington, again, the nature of how does erosion work? They worked and worked and worked. It's obviously a river. There's obviously erosion, but they didn't get the point that there had been a huge flood that had caused a huge amount of water when the dam broke. The Missoula flood came through. So the revisability to say we knew it was erosion, but we needed to keep moving forward and be open to other explanations to really get a fuller understanding.
That's right. So the geologists who developed that explanation of the scablands, they weren't just stuck in the words that represented or described or tried to explain the phenomena earlier.
Yes.
They were actually wrestling with the realities involved
Yeah.
and with open to imagine what had not been recorded in
Yes.
the transcripts at that stage.
Yeah.
By the way, in addition to Travis Stevick's book Encountering Reality, on the realism of TF, starting point for this, try any of Esther Meek's books on Polanyi, like Contact with Reality. It's fantastic. Or there's a great chapter, and also published as a separate article somewhere, by Mike Habets on the conflict between TF and the fundamentalism of Carl Henry, and over precisely this question: do we interpret the words of Scripture in kind of a flat way where we focus on the words, or do we see the words as the means by which God enables us to meet with Him, to have real contact with Him, that He shows up in those words? And I think Mike's treatment of that is very helpful for this whole question of
Yeah.
a realistic approach in any science.
Yeah.
Our focus is on the reality involved, not the words. One might even be able to jump into the old debates over nominalism. Are we preoccupied with the terms and the names of things, or with the things named?
Good. The words are lenses through which we can see and keep exploring at some level. So to say God only gives you a very broad thing. To say the Christian God, and particularly the God revealed in Jesus, I mean, we just keep getting clearer and clearer. So the opening
Right.
statement of Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, Christian dogmatics is the church's scientific self-examination of its distinctive talk about God. So it's say we're not going to just hold them as things that are there. We're going to keep saying, what do we mean? And it
Yeah.
is exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And to do that, we have to have a community, and that's why he said church. So
Yes.
the same thing for any science. There has to be a community. It's not merely an individual event, or else the individual is more likely to just self-project.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things in this section on the differences between theology and the other sciences is to be objective. We can't expect God to be like a rock. Right? So there's, right?
Mhm. You know, some of my earliest memories are in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And so from a young age, I was just overwhelmed with the majesty of the mountains.
Mhm.
But that's truly nothing compared to the majesty of the triune God.
Hmm.
And so I love his emphasis that humility and certainty go together.
Hmm.
Certainty comes from the compelling revelation of the reality of this majestic reality that is so much greater than us. We
Hmm.
cannot deny it.
Mm.
But the humility also has the same source. It's this majestic reality that is so greater than we imagined. I'm
Yeah,
humble in the face of it.
absolutely.
But there are analogs in science, uh, but the real one, the real majesty, is the one we encounter in theology.
Mhm. Who we never get tired of discovering the depths of what that might mean, who he is and who he
That's
is
right.
to us and who he is in himself. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So
But I'm such a small person, I could never get tired of the depths of reality revealed to me in one species of algae. So how about that?
who told you were a small person?
Gandalf did. I'm a hobbit by nature.
Yes. Well, you're large in my eyes. So your second point, in theology, there is a radical difference in theology, for God cannot be confined to our formulations. So that's the it's not quite the uncertainty principle, but it's something of the humility principle. God can be known only through himself and not by reference beyond him. And so in theology, the ultimacy of God is the true ground of objectivity. And then you mentioned before God, humility and certainty go inseparably together. So there's a focusing of the clarity here, um, the difference between God and the other sciences. In theology, God has to be the one who we can't confine to our knowledge, and yet he is the focus of our knowledge. And even the nature of knowing God through himself, there's the particularity of the person of Jesus, though we would say, God the Father, Yahweh in the Old Testament reveals God, and Jesus is revealed as one who is the revelation of that Old Testament God, who we've often misread, and we need Jesus to clarify with theological science to say Jesus is the one who clarifies for us the nature of that God who is consistent yesterday, today, and forever. And so in reading the New Testament, we discover the Old Testament more clearly. Does that fit within what this section's saying?
Sure. Yeah.
And the nature of humility kind of is that not it's the ability to be revised, right? To say to walk in the Spirit is to live a life open to the revision that the Spirit brings.
Yes. We're unless we become like children, we cannot enter the kingdom of God in any
Amen.
science, but especially theological science. We have to have that humility, but
Mhm.
also the trust. When when the reality discloses itself, we trust it.
So at the bottom of 296 and going to the top of 297, Torrance says, this is why for Einstein, the advance to relativity theory did not undermine, but only serve to strengthen dogmatic realism in scientific knowledge, although the way in which it had been conceived had to be changed. For any natural science, then, to claim finality for the reference of the theories would be tantamount to rejecting objectivity. So he's really trying to shake us up on what we mean by objectivity here.
Yeah, how cool that objectivity does is linked with open-endedness. Because of this stance of humility. We're investigating realities that are beyond ourselves, so we have no grounds to assume that we have plumbed the depths of them. There's a real majesty in any reality that we're investigating, all the more so for theology. And so we always have to have that openness.
Yeah.
I think my my 18-year-old grandson and his parents
18
are
months?
18 months.
Yes.
Uh,
You said year, so I just wanted to clarify that
oh,
we're
oh, thank you for catching that. Yeah,
just
he's
have
a
to
little guy.
clarify the objectivity of the object of our knowledge.
Yes, and the limitations of our knowing and
Yes.
speaking. So, so they're close to your house, Marty. They're up in Washington on
Okay.
vacation. Well, their house here in Oklahoma is right on a flight path for the Oklahoma City airport. And he loves to say airplane. He can't quite pronounce it. He doesn't have very many words yet, but boy, airplane, he knows when it's going over. And before boarding the plane at the airport, he could say airplane when seeing this massive airplane on the
Mm.
ground. And then getting on the airplane for the first time. Airplane, he knows it. When looking out the window at the wing, airplane, he knows it. Just think of how he's learning more and more about the plane, what an airplane is, by actually getting on the plane and going somewhere and seeing the mountains out the window down below. He knew what an airplane was in his backyard. And that's really where we all are in all of our sciences. We're no more than the little child in the backyard.
Mm.
Getting on the airplane and going
Mm.
across the mountains is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So we open to that kind of revision and extension and enriching of our understanding of a reality that always outpaces us.
Mm.
We're children.
Mhm. Beautiful. So in the next sub point that you have on page 298, in theology, we have a twofold objectivity, ultimate and proximate. And I'm assuming that we're moving here to something that's unique to the study of God and not necessarily true to the nature of the physical world. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so, because God truly is transcendent, and as was just said, that we don't explain him by reference to things beyond him. The majesty of the mountain I might explain as I grow older by understanding the different kinds of rocks and the different events that upheave the mountains, the erosion that's happened since, one thing after another, but we don't do that with God. And later on, we'll see in the chapter, Torrance quoting Duns Scotus even said, we don't refer to God as first cause either. He's truly, truly something transcendent.
Mhm.
And so we are we come in theology face to face with something that is uh, 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 truly unique. Theology has this ultimate objectivity that we must commit ourselves to, while it absolutely transcends our ability to apprehend, unless it makes itself known to us.
Mm. And this is what Bart would have talked about with the infinite qualitative distinctive,
Yeah,
using Kierkegaard, that God is not merely available for us, he is ultimately qualitatively distinct from us. And people often just think, well, God's just not available then. And so it is simply kind of the statement that we have to recognize the uniqueness of this God. But the second point, the proximal objectivity, is that this ultimate unique God can also make himself known.
that that is God's omnipotence, that this ultimate transcendent reality can exercise the impossible um, um, achievement of lifting us up through his assumption of humanity so that we can know him.
Mhm.
I think of Calvin talking about somewhere, I can't remember, maybe a commentary on the Psalms, about how God, the Holy Spirit speaking to us through Scripture,
Mhm.
did not shun uh, the necessity of speaking in baby talk
Mhm.
in order to get through to us.
Mhm.
And he's willing to speak to us with childish babbling just to be present to us.
Mhm.
But even more so than in the incarnation, the assumption of our humanity by the word, eternal word made flesh, that's not us rising up to God. That's God bringing our humanity and everything, all of the creation that goes with that, up into a, a relationship where we can know him.
Mhm.
So this impossible possibility is itself a created reality through the incarnation, that he's made it possible for us to
Mhm.
know.
So that's availability would be another word for proximity. It's the availability of that which is an ultimate reality that would be otherwise inaccessible.
Right. And he's given us his name. He's
Yeah,
made himself available to us.
yeah,
Emmanuel, God with us.
yeah. Ted had a comment there. Ted, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I'm really appreciate, Kerry, what you're talking about. And as you were talking about being open to knowing, it flashed in my mind was the work of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey and their study of the primates.
Oh yeah.
There's a kind of knowing that they had about that is very different than reading about apes in a book.
Oh my goodness, yes,
Yeah.
right. And what a great example also of being of not transferring the methods of an impersonal field of science
Yeah.
into what it means to know a primate society.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were willing, yeah. That's Jane Goodall is an amazing example of, I think, of catechise and
Yeah.
no
One of
no
my heroes.
no surprise that she and Francis Collins are good friends, and that
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
she gave a wonderful tribute in that Templeton event that I mentioned.
Yeah, I'll have to watch that.
Yeah, you'll really like it. If you like N.T. Wright or Jane Goodall, you'll love that Templeton.
I like them all. Yep.
Very good. It
And
strikes me that John 1:18 is really captures this. No one has seen God at any time. That's the ultimate objectivity. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom or the heart of the Father, he has come to, and the word exegete is there in the Greek, but to make available is the proximal opening up of that which was otherwise. The ultimate reality is made proximate, available to us. And so I think it captures in a single verse what it is that he's trying to say in theological knowledge here.
Oh, I like that. Thanks, Marty. That's helpful.
It certainly speaks to the humility of God.
Yeah.
It does. It
Kind of
does.
sense. Yeah.
And that God wants to be known.
Yes.
And that we have to be able to listen. Those I can't remember the word you said that triggered me, but the whole idea of the sheep know the shepherd's voice is to assume that there is a God who is ultimate, but that the objectivity of God is not to remain silent to us, but that there is a being known that is true to the objectivity of God, that this God wants to be known. And for us to discover actually who we are, our own discovery of ourselves is proximal to that.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
just
So-
wanted to jump in here and emphasize in several conversations, being back from Princeton and having a chance to talk to people and having people say, there's so much that people just don't get about art, because they either see him as the objectively objective objectivist, and they find that dubious, or they see him as so subjective that he's the subjectivist, and they find that dubious. Either one they see is irrational. But Barth is neither of those things. He's both of them at the same time. And by doing that, he lays out for folk how we can be rational and speak rationally about the God who exceeds our reason and even exceeds our universe. But it's still rational for us by God's grace. I went back to take a look. If Kerry was right, this is a recapitulation of things that Thomas said before. Even in this book, I went back to check. There's the index entries for objectivity and subjectivity are the two longest entries in the index. He's always talking about this because he deals either with people who say if it's not objective, it's not true, and therefore it is unknowable. Or if it's not subjective, it's not true, and therefore it is unknowable. And what we've been adducing here in several examples is that even in regular physical sciences or the organic sciences and biosciences, everything is subjective and objective at the same time, and that's why it works.
Mhm.
It is how rationality works in science and in religion. Because it is what theology has in common with all the other sciences. So what we're trying to hear in this particular section, he's trying to say, but there is a difference. There are a few key differences, and I want to go back and recapitulate them again, because I did this about 150 pages and you fell asleep. So I'm going to do it here again.
Yes.
That God makes God's own self an object to us, because omnipotence can do this. And in that objectivity, we can genuinely know God. Wow, that's what I am dismayed when I read in public media the more or less the attitude of, I don't know what's true, I don't know what's false, I know what I believe. I'm like, do you? Do you really? How? Because the corollary to that is, and therefore I can say anything I damn well want, and you can't tell me I'm wrong. All of this that we're laboring under here is one very good thinker trying to lay out, having seen this at work in science and in religion, to talk about the basic rationality of knowing that it's not canned ham. I think the rescue of our public theology may be in learning this again, maybe for the first time, but learn it again, that this is what can make real theology credible again to a very skeptical in a public that has been burned so many times by bad theology, paper theology, as Tom used to call it. There was the popular stuff, and I'm just in the process of reading a section of my library of things that were the pop theology's greatest hits from the 1960s, and I'm going, nobody reads this anymore. Nobody reads this anymore. It's all paper theology. But to be able to challenge one another to think hard this way, think very hard this way, because this is how science works. This is how theology works when it works. And this is how psychology works. This is how we are rational. As I say, when I listen to our public discourse, it seems to be increasingly irrational. And it seems like there are so many people that say the more crazy it gets, the more I think they're on to something. Well, that's red pill theology. We'll call it that.
So we have a lot of empty churches because I think people don't feel like they have access to the ultimate objectivity. All they have is access to their
if they got
needs.
somebody up in the pulpit that says, I don't know really what's true here, but I have a hunch when I read this parable that it's something like this. I am not going to be martyred in the Colosseum because you have an idea that it's something like this. I went to a Christmas sermon 50 years ago, and the bishop got up and he said, well, I don't know what to say about the incarnation. And I almost jumped up and then sit down and shut up. Let somebody who does have something to say about the incarnation give us a sermon. Fortunately, I was way too polite. But this objectivity and subjectivity, how it is rational, not necessarily like the physical sciences, but it is still rational. Maybe, and I'm really interested to see what he has to say about the social sciences, for example, history.
Yes. Well,
thanks so much, Ken. I
Go ahead.
appreciate those comments about objectivity and subjectivity and the continuity with Bart. It really does summarize or put in a good light Torrance's combination of those themes in this section of the chapter. I do feel, and don't you all feel, that Bart scholars have so much to gain in reading and understanding Bart if they would also be able to approach Bart through Torrance's eyes. That he saw things in Bart that help open up Bart to us if we learn to see his development of them. And one of those developments, I think, is evident in this chapter, where Torrance, I think, took Bart's understanding of theology as a theological science, but is able to set it in relationship to other sciences because he applied it to the other fields of science as well. In other words, I think did I use this analogy last week? I might have. Imagine you're playing in a bathtub or a swimming pool, a child with some floating blocks. Each block is a science. For Barth, I get the feeling that there's just one science he's thinking about, and that's theology. But for Torrance, there's a whole universe of floating blocks. All the sciences are floating around and potentially can interact with each other. And and to me, that constant reminder that there are multiple sciences in relationship or potential relationship is a development of Torrance that goes beyond Barth without, but it's Barthian.
This era where he brings it to voice finally. I noticed earlier that Theological Science, which he published at age 56, is the first full-length, 352 pages, argument from him in his entire academic career. He has never spent this much time organizing his thinking. And there's a paragraph in the preface where he describes he essentially wrote this book over 3 times to get it to where he was willing to let go of it, because there was so much stuff that he needed to correct and self-correct and amend. But one of his handicaps, and I put this out there, is that his preferred vehicle of written expression was a formal essay, and in hands that meant a 16 to 20 page, tightly focused, highly concentrated exposition of one well-defined term. That is where he was most comfortable. And if this sounds a little forced in places, it's because he is stacking these short essays into chapters and then stacking the chapters into this book, which he, as I just discovered to my surprise, he never had done before. Even his doctoral dissertation was barely 150 pages. This was the first time he did a long exposition of what he had come to think and see. And he wouldn't do it again. I noticed the Trinitarian faith in 1988, the Christian Doctrine of God in 1994, and Scottish Theology, oddly, in 1996, are the only other books longer than this one.
In contrast to Barth, one really wonders what he might have done if he hadn't been in circumstances that required occasional remarks. So many of his books are collections of remarks for a particular occasion. And think of the different versions of his essay on natural theology, the transformation of natural theology. They're all different in some way, tweaked for that particular occasion. And I think wish that many of us could have. We wish maybe we had benefited from if he had been given the opportunity to have a more systematic and comprehensive time to write. But I'm glad
Bruce,
that we have what we have.
Bruce has a comment there. Bruce, did you want to comment on your comment?
No, it was just a thought that came to mind when I was listening to Ken speaking there about the kind of modern view of subjectivity, which really rejects the idea of there being a true knowledge out there. And I've just, in front of me, I've got my undergraduate notes from TF's lectures. And I just found this sentence in it, where it says, even animals have a rationality which acts in accordance with the nature of things, but they cannot distinguish a subjective and an objective state of affairs. And it just seemed to me, I'd have to give this more thought, that it did resonate with some of the things that Ken was saying. And in a sense, God has given us this ability to be able to think rationally, in the sense of being able to distinguish between the objective and the subjective. It's a God-given gift. And but yeah, you cannot prove that we have that ability if you're only working from natural presuppositions. And so in a sense, it's almost something which faith gives, which belief in our creator God and belief that he has made us in his image, etc., actually gives and enhances our understanding of our own humanity. away from just, the biological production line.
Yes. Just throw in a plug. We're going to be looking at T.F. Torrance's Karl Barth, Biblical and Theological Theologian, Biblical and Evangelical Theologian is our next book. So we'll begin that in August after we finish Theological Science. So we'll be going into what exactly we're talking about, the value that Torrance found in Barth's work and helping that to add to our lenses. The nature of animals, I think that it's easy to see the objectivity, but animals, our dog Rosie, when you say treat, we say that's her middle name. Rosie treat. She responds with a motive of response that is there to say there is something subjective that Rosie knows what these things mean and she responds to it. So to say the level of complexity in an animal is not at the level of the human, and there's much that is missing, but that we can certainly see in just recognizing the nature of the act, the response, the interrelationship that we have with our animals, that there's certainly something more there than just an object, and that it does begin to live into the science of the personal.
Yeah, I think, when TF was speaking to us back in the 1970s, there wasn't so much awareness of intelligence in animals and so on. So he might want to rephrase what he said there. But I think his main point, still sort of stands, or what is indicating that it's an element of irrationality, or one of the characteristics of irrational thinking is this difficulty in distinguishing between the subjective and the objective, and then blending them together and relating them.
Well, we could, I mean, it'll be something that we'll continue to explore, the science of animals and even plants at one level, make choices, it seems, to pursue light and other things. And so when does the rationality of even the living things we call plants reflect something that has a sense of choice in the pursuit of particularly the light, but there's other things, water would be another. So they're all very interesting things, but to say that for the purpose of what we're talking about here, there is an orderliness in the world that we are not superimposing on it. We are simply coming to recognize it. And the question of what it is that we say about it is in a learning place. So what you just said, he didn't know as much about animals then as we do now, is simply to say we're still in that growing learning about the nature of animals and the ordering of their way of being in the world and with humans. That's part of the scientific process.
Bruce, did he ever use an illustration of shutting up one of his sheepdog puppies and keeping it away from the sheep for a period of time and then releasing the dog into the yard where the sheep were? Does that sound familiar to you?
No, I haven't heard that one, Ken, but he may have used it in other places, yeah.
The point being that a sheepdog figured out all by himself in a matter of seconds that those were sheep, and the thing to do with sheep is herd them, and off he went. That's, I would call that a rational response from an animal. He was demonstrating that to a class of people all post-Kantian. They were all busy trying to figure out rationality in terms of objective knowings. That was a Scottish common sense philosophy reply to continental skeptical, rationalist, realist philosophy. And he was just tossing it off.
Yeah. Todd, did you want to say something about your comment?
No, it goes about as deep as my mind goes.
Okay, well, we'll do some analysis of that then and see how far we can go into the mind of Todd Norquist. Looking then at a restatement, pages 298 to 99, you quote, in all other sciences, the human knower and the known object are both creaturely realities. And the distinguishing thing in this is to say in theological science, we have a divine object. Is that the clarification we want to get here?
Yeah, I think that's good.
And the point he wants to make from Duns Scotus is?
Well, to say God is the first cause is to put him on a creaturely level.
Okay.
And he's just beyond that. So So it, to whatever extent he's a first cause, that's his own voluntary descent by grace to act in a way. So he he channels Duns Scotus a lot, I think.
Yeah. And I guess the question of to what degree in the person of Jesus Christ we say things that are analogia relationis. So, I mean, it's back to my question about does God have emotions? In the person of Jesus Christ, there is the act of love, the call to love, as I have loved you, love one another, which would say that the emotive life is available for understanding the science of who Jesus is as one who acts in an orderly way out of the emotive life of love. And the fruit of the Spirit is the development of that in ourselves. And yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something that looked like?
Oh, talking to me?
Yes.
Oh, the humanity of Jesus. He's assumed our humanity, and therefore all these creature realities can become ways in which he discloses himself to us. But
Mhm.
it's a way of grace, not a way
Yes.
of necessity. Yeah.
Which is the next section. And in a sense, what we do with animals is kind of an analogia relationis with animals, is say, because Jesus is this way and we are this way, we can ask questions about the nature of using words like love of dogs. And we're asking analogia relationis kind of questions, I think. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, can I come back to the Duns Scotus and the first cause
Yes.
here?
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Kerry, in your notes here, you have for this reason, God is not even a first cause. The TF cites Duns Scotus, and I was just looking at the footnote on page 299 there. Does he really say that in an absolute way? I mean, obviously, in one sense, God is a first cause. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He caused things to happen, not necessarily in a necessary sequence. Because in the footnote, it says, this is a question raised by Duns Scotus when he insists that natural knowledge of God as first cause does not allow us to reach a God above and beyond the causal series to which we ourselves belong. So, I mean, I suppose it's all within the limits of how much you can put on the piece of paper there.
Yeah. No,
I mean,
I agree.
God is first cause.
Point taken. I agree. I think what I meant in trying to summarize it, I should have been more careful, but what I meant was the whole approach of reasoning by logic to a first cause from creature realities. We can prove God through that first cause argument.
It's one of the standing intellectual proofs of God. And doesn't Thomas Aquinas detail that in the chapter of the Summa?
Yes, and so Scotus is rejecting that. Yeah.
Right. And, somebody at the seminar at the conference was saying that's natural theology. If you want to start with natural theology, you're not going to get to God. He was commenting on Paul's letter to the Romans.
Yeah.
The lecture.
118.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of Thomas's five ways. And so Bruce, I completely take your point. By grace, God condescends to be even a first cause and intermediate cause and concurrent cause and all the other kinds of ways we can think of to try to talk about divine action in the world. But the existence of the world and his involvement in it is first by grace and not something that gives us a standing
But
to argue.
the TF, one of the things that he said quite frequently was, the universe cries out for God.
Yeah.
So in a sense, there isn't a mathematical proof, but there's an inexorable pointing to God and almost a desire of the universe to confess God, which comes from viewing these things.
Yeah.
It can never take you the final step, but
and I think he talks about we reframe Aquinas's five ways and other arguments that can be deployed in a traditional foundationalist natural theology, we reframe those as pointers, and then they are meaningful. So the same thing goes for the contingent character of order and of history. It's not a proof of God, but on the other hand, the way I understand TF is through the stratification of the sciences. We've got physics, chemistry, biology, human sciences, so on. Theology is one of those sciences that needs to be understood in relationship to the others. And just as each level of contingent order studied by a single science is open to the order of the science above, so all those levels of science are open to the order explored by theology, which provides that understanding of God's grace in creation arising through a divine freedom to love, and supremely expressed in the resurrection, the beginning of the new creation, which reorders every level of contingent order beneath it. So to me, Bruce, this is my interpretation of both theological science, ground and grammar, and his other times when he's talking about this. He's reframing those traditional natural theological arguments with an understanding of the stratified relationship of sciences, each one open to the one above, and all of them culminating in the new creation introduced by the resurrection, that we are to understand all the other levels of contingent reality in light of the new creation set on a new basis. And that comes out, I think, most clearly in resurrection and space-time and resurrection. There are extended pages there where he's talking about the resurrection affecting the hierarchical ordering of the sciences. So to me, I take that and use that as a key to his discussion of natural theology elsewhere.
I think for Karl Barth to talk about the glory of God that fills the earth, it is that which goes off from God that we can't read onto God from it, but we have to recognize that it is the nature of God's work. In his discussion on the lesser lights, Christ is the light that comes into the world, but these other things that the sciences investigate and all that are the lesser lights that have their being because of the light that has come into the world. So I think Barth himself did make a way for a discussion of these things to be read unidirectionally from God is an analogia kind of way of thinking, but really makes space for exactly what you're saying.
In the last pages, which we won't get to, but I copied them from a handout for chapter 4 of Ground and Grammar. Here's a diagram of each science deals with one level of contingent order, and yet they're open to the order of the one above them, in that in many cases, the order studied by the higher science can explain a reason why for phenomena found in a lower science. And then he's arguing that the stratified relationship, open upwards, not reducible downwards, which owes a lot to Polanyi, of course, that the resurrection establishes theology as a science in relationship to those other sciences. And so that's taken up more. The reference to one of the places in Space, Time, and Resurrection is given there, and also Ground and Grammar. So maybe that's helpful.
Yeah.
I was surprised when I went back and looked at my notes from when I was there in like 1975. He was using the mottos of Einstein to frame his lecture points. God does not wear God's heart on God's sleeve, for example, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
He was not doing that when I was there in 1974. That was added. And another thing that seemed to be added or was becoming grist for the mill was Gödel's theorem. that all systems must be open-ended to another larger and embracing system. He began drawing inverted charts like this, or up on the chalkboard to point out what he meant. And the back rows in the lecture hall were all going, "Who is doing what? And how is that?" It seemed that it was taking everybody by surprise. I had to admit, I had not read Gödel, but I knew that in Boston, it was being read and it was being passed around. I was startled to see it up there and go, "Oh, that's how that works." It's a very formative time in Tom's mind. But I checked the index. Gödel is only cited, I think, 4 times in Theological Science, and all of it under problems of logic. He's not jumping to Gödel's theorem as a basic charter for understanding how we arrange our knowledge into hierarchies. Not yet.
Yeah, there's definite growth in Torrance's thinking after this book. I appreciate that point a lot. I also remember McGrath in his biography emphasizing how the effect that the demonstration of relativity in, was it 1921-ish or maybe 1920? I can't remember when the 1918 eclipse data was really presented as proving the general theory, but the point is that McGrath portrays Torrance as being aware of that and watching that and discussing it with Daniel Lement and others. As an undergraduate, he was following the developments in modern physics. So we really need more biographical studies with the help of the archives there at Princeton to chart the development. How are those things really percolating in his mind? How is he thinking? And then what is the pattern of his deployment of them in his writings? Your comment here about him bringing those into lectures is really pertinent. Good, important evidence for that kind of study of his intellect.
And there's the classroom handouts. There's a whole doctoral dissertation right there. Collecting the handouts, using internal evidences to arrange them in the chronological sequence so you can see him develop his thought, what drops out, what gets read in, when the meanings of certain words change. In some ways, his intellect was so awesome that many people think that he was always this brilliant. Even Elmer Kyler would say, "I know he's hard to read. I'm not going to try to read him in order. I'm going to read him logically from his final achieved systemization." It's just too much work. I can't do it.
Yes. Let me put in a plug. The other Ken left, who I didn't know, but just for the record, I'm not a theologian. I'm a historian of science. I'm a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma, and one of my roles is to be curator of the history of science collections there. We have 100,000 volumes. We're one of the largest history of science collections anywhere, and a dozen faculty in the history of science, and scholars come from around the world to use the materials. One distinguished scholar was it March, Marty?
Yes, all of March.
It was such a joy to have you. Last
Joy to
week,
be there.
this month, we've had scholars from London and from Notre Dame, for example. But I'm in the process of starting a T.F. Torrance collection. And the goal is not at all to rival Princeton. Princeton is the place to go for Torrance's theology. And we really need more scholars to work on Torrance's biography, as I just said. But the goal is to preserve the papers that Princeton doesn't want, Edinburgh doesn't want, and especially the penumbra of people who interacted with the Torrance brothers, whose materials will be helpful to researchers 50 to 100 years from now, trying to enter into the milieu of where all this came from. And so, especially those who were his students or his colleagues or people who interacted with him, those papers now have a place to go. I don't want them to be here rather than Princeton, but if they're not going to be at Princeton, they need to not be
Discarded.
lost. And
And
so,
Robert Walker's stuff has come to you.
so Bob Walker has given his notes, the class notes that led to his editing of Incarnation and Atonement. Chris Kaiser has given some of his notes. Some others have given their class notes. I would like every copy of class notes we can get, because so some scholar would be able to trace the changes that take place through the years. So that's just one example of the type of materials that we would like. Also, recordings. Donald Walker and others have given us dozens of hours of recordings, not so much by TF, but by others. We'll be, over time, converting those from analog. Bob Walker's recently given all of the recordings he has for the Torrance retreats. I've already converted all of those to digital and to a web-friendly form. I've added about half of them now to the website. But the goal is to get all these auxiliary materials to allow future scholars to develop a fuller, more nuanced picture of Torrance's development in relationship to all of the whole communities that he's a part of. So
Which ties into the way of grace. All
there we
these
go.
things are being given. I mean, we're getting to know T.F. Torrance, but through T.F. Torrance, we come to know what he discovered as a scientific thinker into the life of God, right?
Yep.
And Michael Polanyi, who you left there, is Polanyi was one of those who helped him to clarify what it means to be a theologically scientific person. And at some level, the way of grace is to say the uniqueness of theological sciences is the nature of the God who is known. And at some level, Michael Polanyi helped to break through into the world of the hearing and engaging. And now we're losing Bruce again. Okay.
Bye-bye,
Thanks,
Bruce.
Bruce. See you later. So the determinative significance of God, your bottom of the page point, that God is a voluntary object, which we know only through response to his unconditional self-giving. This is unique objectivity. So again, for the purpose of the distinction of theology with the other sciences, only God can have this voluntary self-giving that is the foundation upon which we do the work we do of scientific theology. The top of page 5, then, analogy with biology. And so he's going to use the stratification here. So you've just been talking about that some.
Yeah, I think I covered that.
Yeah, so physics, chemistry, biology, theology are strata. If you just think of a hillside with strata that are there, and to say each one implies that which is above it, or in that case, it may be below. What's on top implies what's below. We have to flip the strata maybe with the geological image of what's going on. The nature of the problem of not dealing well with our analogies is the problem of, and I wrote in the column, fragmentation, abstraction, generalizations, all those things lose, which your term that you use of reductionism is another term for the same kind of thing. So whenever the sciences do those things, and particularly of God, to simply say God at some level is too abstract, too generalized to know what God are we speaking. So Jeremy Bigby says, I always pray saying in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, which I've done ever since he said that, because I want people to know which God it is in whose name I am praying. So I think that's part of the science of the clarification. And of course, T.F. Torrance would say, until I hear a theologian pray, I'm not sure that I have heard the nature of the authenticity or what it is they're able to say by knowing the living God, that their prayer life opens up to us to really understand what's going on. So he does on page 301. I just have to point, John McMurray once again shows up. Reason and emotion. Thank you. I will be doing an essay at some point. I'm working on a different one now, but on the scientific influence of John McMurray on T.F. Torrance for a future participatio that And these are the kinds of things that I'll be going to look for the scientific categorization. For McMurray, in the book Reason and Emotion, there is a very particularity to reason and emotion that doesn't merely collapse them into fuzzy feelings. They are part of the wholeness by recognizing the particularity of things, and that emotion allows us that intuitive, as Torrance would say, the intuitive engagement with things, which is an emotional development to engage the other in these objective kind of ways. So again, part of the clarity of what it is that McMurray helps to bring to Torrance.
Yeah, I so appreciate that work, Marty.
The point where you come down the particular and the general 301, 302, again, we never choose between the particular and the general, but we recognize that the particular is what gives us a validation of making kind of general statements. So to say, that is a human, okay, I got that. There's some things there. What particular human is it? Or when I sit with couples and the husband or the spouse or the wife says, any man or any woman would love to be with me. It's like, well, you know what? We don't have any man or any woman here. We have this man or woman. So we have to figure out what we're going to do in this relationship if we're going to go forward. So that's the value of the particularity, I think, that we get. And I do wonder, as I walk into churches that increasingly become empty and beautiful churches in around the world, that there's something about art that is beautiful, but it's just abstract enough because it's up there that it doesn't do the work of the particular of a person. I always say, walking out knowing they've heard the voice of the living God who said something to them today. That's the particularity of theological work in the life of a person. So, and the concrete particularity of Jesus, page 302, 303, you say a beautiful paragraph, one of my favorites. And so I just have to have you say, tell us of the beauty and what it is about this paragraph for you.
Oh gosh, let me open it up here. The concrete 302, 303. I have written in the margin preparatio evangelium, the preparation for the gospel, just the emphasis on the absolute particularity of Jesus Christ. That's a phrase halfway through the paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
This incredible paradox that what is universally essential for humanity is presented to us in the form of a concrete particular.
Mm.
Torrance, in a number of different places, talks about the need by the church fathers to reconstruct the Hellenistic foundations of reason, where from Aristotle on, what is rational must be universal, must be causal, must be necessary, and what is irregular, what is rare, or what is singular, what is particular, is by nature, by definition, irrational and unintelligible. So there was this absolute distinction between chance and necessity. And the early church, as it began to explain what had happened in the resurrection of Christ, the incarnation and resurrection, was faced with this habit of thought that was so deep. It was not merely a problem for the philosophers. It was a deep confusion. How can the particular be intelligible? How can the particular be meaningful?
Mm.
And in the most personal way, how can the particular, like me, be meaningful in a universe that is a universe of chance and necessity? So because of the incarnation, the church fathers had to argue for contingent order as an alternative to the chance versus necessity binary. That nothing is by necessity. Even things that are regular are contingent order. Nothing is by chance. Even unique events are part of a contingent history. And so while contingent and chance are sometimes used as synonyms by many today, to the Christian, they're different. And every understanding of any particular as having significance or meaning, I see as an echo of the incarnation upon culture. And that includes all the arts that depend on the particularity of the materials and of the, artists work with particularity. Literature works with particularity. Our own sense of meaning, and when we're talking with any particular person to affirm them as who they are, not just an instance of a general human nature. All of these, and a sense of history, the reality and meaning of history, contingent history. All of these are part of the sensibility that is gifted to us by the reality of God hallowing the particular, sanctifying the particular through this ultimate, absolute particularity of being born in Bethlehem and raised from the empty tomb. Those were neither necessary events nor chance events, but they have immense ramifications for everything that is particular.
Thank you. And just to say, can we say that ties into subjectivity, and that the particularity of a human person hearing, engaging, encountering the nature of Christ, whether it's in worship in that first strata of Torrance's work, that doxology is the first strata in theological knowledge, that subjectivity is the meeting of the person in such a way that the Cataphusan discovery process is then able to unfold. So it's not what people often say, oh, you're just being subjective, meaning it's just your opinion, epinoia, but it's dianoia, as Alan Torrance always say. It's not epinoia, opinion, it's dianoia, to see through the person of Christ in a Polanyian kind of way, to see through the person of Christ into the life of the living God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So subjectivity is an appropriate scientific stance that is able to be formed by the nature of the object that is encountered. In the case of a person, it is to adapt or listen to, or in the case of with our spouses, to fall in love with them is a subjective, but it's not merely just a feeling. It's that who this particular person is, as encountered by you as a particular person, is a meeting that creates something, which we could call it emotional, but it's also rational. You were made for me and I was made for you. And, I make a rational choice to say, would you spend the rest of your life with me? I mean, all of this, the nature of love is a rational way of being in light of the other who calls us to a covenant relationship. Is that fair to say of subjectivity?
Oh yeah, I love it. And so it's my love for my wife is subjective in that it requires a personal commitment and devotion on my part, but it's also objective in the sense that it's a commitment and a devotion to understand her from a center in herself, not merely a center in myself. So my love for her is less and less over time a projection of myself, more and more over time a real understanding of her reality and my ability to help her be all that she really is, not just in service to me.
Yeah.
And then we come to understand that God's love for us is that way as well. As Torrance said, he's the personalizing person.
Yes.
In relationship with him, we become more ourselves rather than less ourselves.
So when he moves in your first statement there, all real knowledge has this personal coefficient. That is the relational dynamic of encountering. And again, we're distinguishing theological science from the other sciences. In theological science, there is a personal coefficient that is, in a sense, unique and distinct as we are addressed by a God. who tells us who we are and who he is. Is that true? Is that an appropriate use of the personal coefficient?
Yeah, I really like that. And this phrase that knowing in any field of science is intensely personal, and we're always addressed by the reality that the science is about, but how much more so when in theological science, the reality is God, the source of all reality.
Yeah.
So yes, intensely personal. I love the breathtaking um, affirmation by Torrance, especially in 1969, that eliminating the personal coefficient would eliminate science altogether.
Hmm.
This is just wonderful. And
Because what would it be if you did that? I mean, what do you have left if you actually eliminate it? I mean, it's like people are nervous about theological intuition. It's
mhm,
like, what do you have if you remove that?
yeah,
Can you even do?
it makes me think of the chapter in um, I think it's Orthodoxy by Chesterton, the maniac, that talks about the loops of logic that might be too far to see across immediately, but the maniac is one who's trapped in a logical circle and can't
Yes.
get out. And we'd be reduced to just chasing our own loops that way.
Yeah.
It,
And
with
I think
yeah,
Chesterton says there's nobody more reasonable than the madman. Everything makes perfect sense to him. It just doesn't connect with anyone else.
there we go. Right. And it's that personal commitment to reality that gets us off that plane
Right.
of the logical loop. We're
Right.
not merely logical. The logic is pointing to reality, not trapped on its own.
Yeah.
But we'd
And
be
Pascal's statement, love has reasons that reason does not know. That's not exact quote, but is in a sense, it is the option of what Torrance is bringing up, that there is a reasonability by virtue of love that knows things that can't be reduced to the script, but they
right.
are truer knowing.
So cognitive knowing is a form of love, no doubt
Yes.
about it. Being willing to let the center move to the object being known instead of always being within ourselves.
So in the quote you have there, science is a function of human minds in which spontaneous imagination and judgment play a considerable role. So I mean, he's creating the space for the arts there as well at some level, right?
That's right. And for the study of the history of science
And
as
the
well
history,
as the history of art. Yeah,
yes.
you bet.
And to say every scientific document written up is an artifact of that scientific investigation. And by virtue of being an artifact, it is a piece of art that is shaped and presented in a way to attempt to be understood. So, I mean, it really is opening a door for the artistic dimension of the sciences, I would say.
Yeah. Let me give an example in theological science. Suppose a student is studying for the first time the centuries leading up to the Council of Nicaea and is dismayed at the intrusion of all these personal, social, cultural, political um, uh, factions that are, or uh, forces that are part of the whole debate.
Yeah.
That, in one way, that's a personal coefficient. One might think, but the Nicene theology should have been able to develop in a pure way. Well, to affirm the personal coefficient of debates over Nicene theology does not take away the legitimacy of Nicene theology. It's it ought to be what we expect, that that God is working to in any field of science to bring us to deeper knowledge in that field of science in a way that fully involves our personhood, our culture, our including all the contrary forces of chaos. Everything is engaged and moving that way.
Mm.
Um, in my handout back on page 10, let me let me give you an example. This is in the addendum that it's 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 got this diagram on the top of the page.
Yes.
And this is an addendum from the Ground and Grammar of Theology. Yeah. And it's a long quote. The bulk of this is the middle paragraph is mainly a quote from the historian of geology, Martin Rudwick. I'm not going to read it here, but it's about the development of a sense of contingent history in geology and how that was linked to belief in divine freedom to love. But what I say in the last paragraph is even if the social coefficient of intellectual culture favored its emergence at that time, favored the emergence of a discovery of geological ages at that time, because people had internalized a sense of God's providence in human history. It was easy to transfer that over to God's providence in the history of the earth, the history of nature. So even if the social coefficient of intellectual culture favored the emergence of geology at that time, geohistory was still a cataphysis in development within geology. So geology itself provided the basis for discovering pre-human periods of geological history. But it was discovered by people who had internalized the who were open to these discoveries because of their internalization of contingent history and human history. That I would submit as an exactly parallel case to Nicene theology. It took a long time and a lot of debates to get to geological periods. It took a long time and a lot of debates to get to Nicene theology. But that's because when doing science, it involves our whole selves, our our persons, our culture, everything. And so we should expect the progress in any science not just to be thinking, disembodied thought. It's fully embodied cultures that are communities that are producing real knowledge. So if all the controversy leading up to Nicaea is seen as invalidating Nicaea, well, all the controversy leading up to geological ages would be seen as invalidating geology. No one would accept the latter, so don't be discouraged by the former.
Yeah. Ray Anderson gave a lecture at Salem Pacific University that was the inaugural lecture for a department at Salem Pacific, and he talked about the social ecology of a church. He said
Yeah.
it's all of these dimensions that you're talking about, the way a church functions, that there are all these factors and influences that need to be considered, and that ecology, in a sense, provides just lenses to recognize the scientific investigation of the complexity of the people, the history of the neighborhood, all of these things being part of what goes into the social ecology of the church.
Boy, that's good. That just sounds like Ray Anderson applying all these things in a most practical way.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, if you're interested, I have a very readable account of contingent history in geology in a little paper I just wrote on George MacDonald and the scientific imagination. And you can get to it by going to kerrysloft.com. Search for George MacDonald. You'll find a post of that name, and there's a link to a PDF. And I put a direct link into the chat, but you can get it just kerrysloft.com. Look for the George MacDonald and the scientific imagination, and there's an appendix to that PDF on geology that includes this long quotation from Rudwick, but talks more about it.
Yeah.
Gives you.
And we'll try and see if we can get that posted on the Torrance Reading Group site too, so that people have access to it.
Oh,
Because once
thanks.
we close here, then it won't be. So we'll try and make that available in a number of places.
Thanks.
Yes.
I
So
also
again,
put a link to
go ahead.
the description of the Torrance archive I was talking about earlier.
Yes, that would be also great. I did the link to the Princeton archive you probably saw this week, and just try
Yes.
to make links available so that people can discover. And
Yes.
who's not daunted by 109 feet of shelf space of an archive? I mean, okay. So again, the nature, I was looking at the bottom of 5, it is through personal effort and discipline that we reach objectivity. I think just to recognize subjectivity is the pathway to objectivity, that they're not opposed to one another, but that the two of them cooperate, and that objectivity at some level requires a level of subjectivity to be able to do Confucian work, or it will not happen. In theology, the personal is a predicate of the object. The object demands reciprocity from the person of the theologian. And this is where, whenever there's a pastor who says, I love preaching, I just have a hard time being with the people, it's like, there's something missing here of that Confucian, that knowing and being known. You can only dispense information, but that's only information that will not bring transformation. So to say, science is a transformative role for those who are in positions of leadership and requires what it is that he's asking for here. So on page 6 at the top, can scientific theology be done in an impersonal mode? And I think we have to put the word appropriately. Can it be done appropriately in an impersonal mode? Because we could say it does get done attempting to be impersonal, but even there are personal agendas. Think Dawkins, does he have any personal agendas that direct him to do what he thinks is impersonal, not reading anything in here, and yet there seems to be something going on? Are prayers and worship necessary for the theologian as theologian? That's a great question. And the word necessary is there. We can put contingent maybe in there. For a theologian to, is it contingently necessary for a theologian to be properly a theologian that there is a life of prayer and worship? And we could say that of pastors too, to say pastors are scientists if they are doing the appropriate work of what is being suggested here. If they're not, has the sermon become impersonal? And are they in fact not doing the scientific work of theological science?
Hear, hear. And I just refer everybody to the first chapter of the Trinitarian faith, where Torrance argues that even Nicene faith was theology on its knees, that
yes,
piety and devotion are part of theology in the Nicene tradition.
Yeah. And so we've got a number of pages from 306 to 308 at least are dealing with the nature of the person, looking at Scotus and Calvin.
And we need to look at John McMurray.
All of this in here, Augustine, the nature of Boethius, all these are unpacking. And the basic problem, on McMurray even, this is one of the places where he doesn't quote McMurray, but where he talks about on page 306, Kant and the Romantics. That's the beginning of the self as agent. That's the arguments, the logic, the development, that's all the self as agent. So it's not noted there as coming from the self as agent, but it's quite clear that that's in mind.
McMurray's just part of the water he swims in.
I think that's true. I think that's true. I love your third point that the word face to face with the divine is the nature of the characterization. And that's a term that Torrance uses, but
well, if you haven't read Face to Face by Marty, great collections of essays.
Thank you. But to say face to face is personal knowledge. And, when you do spend time face to face with somebody, even through, this is why I'm not as upset as some people are with Zoom. You do hear intonations, you do see facial expressions, you can ask the stories. The face to face opens up something that is not captured as well in text or other things, where many of the dynamics of the personal are lost. So, and again, this is where the nature of my first book in what will hopefully someday be published as The Science and Art of Relational Theology, reading the Bible relationally, is you can't just look for the text aside from the persons, Father, Son, Spirit, who are speaking it, or you are doomed to read something of your own interpretive framework into it. We have to really see through into those persons and hear them as face to face with voices. Deus Dixit's Barth's term for that. Yes. Or we can't do appropriate theological science or read the Bible in the way that will give us what it is it wants us to have. Yes. The inversion of the subject object is your fourth point. Do you want to say something about the inversion there?
Yeah, we've probably already covered most of these indirectly. So when when I'm trying to know an object and it's an it, well, what if the object is a person? And this is the reason why McMurray and personalism is such an important um, part of the story here. But with theology, to know this person, I just must relinquish my status as the knower, and I need to be willing to embrace being searched and known
Yes.
myself.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. His phrase transsubjective, that's the allowing to be searched, to know the other, to hear their voice, and even not just to hear their voice, but to hear their voice speaking to you specifically, right? It's
yeah, yeah.
there's a specificity. I sometimes use the illustration of a man gets married to a woman, the next day he's gone. For 5 years, she never sees him, but a check comes every month that covers all of her needs and all that. And one night, he walks in, sits down, and says, "Where's dinner?" She says, "What?" He says, "Didn't you get my checks?" "Well, yes, I got checks." "Haven't you had everything taken care of?" "Well, yes, of course." "Well, then what was missing for you?" And the answer is
You.
you.
Yeah.
That is the transsubjective. It's you in particular being here, all of that, the benefits of Christ. It's not the
Yes.
same thing as the knowing and being known that is pointed to here.
Right.
His mention of the eclipse of God, again, Martin Buber's work, and again, the nature of an eclipse, something passes in front of the sun, the moon passing in front of the sun, or the earth creating a shadow.
Yeah.
And so Torrance, he does borrow this in a number of places, I think. And the whole sense of, the human endeavor to know can cause us to trip over ourselves, so to speak,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so
Right.
we get in the way of what it looks like for um, in an eclipse. You know that there are components of moving parts that are there, but you would know enough to know that will pass, that it's temporary. But when it becomes a consistent thing, which, I would argue that individualism has become the eclipse of humanity. We've become so committed to the individual that we can't even see the value of what it means to live in relationships, and think that rugged individualism will give us the fulfillment of humanity, the full light of day. And to go into some of the Scandinavian countries and just hear how different that is. And Douglas Campbell said yesterday, I love that in Finland, everybody every day goes to the sauna, not just because it's cold, because it's where their relationships are formed, the community is formed. And I just thought there the eclipse is gone in a way that it isn't in are, over satisfied with things, but not really able to have the appropriate spa experience of really having all of who we are connecting. And then anthropomorphism in biblical faith. And I think he's saying there, the nature of anthropomorphism is forming things in the shape of the human. And this is, it can become a form of natural theology, right? We just,
If we're not careful. So
if we're not
we see
careful.
theological critique and using the criterion of Christ's own humanity.
Yes.
So through the humanity of Christ, we have a standard to critique anthropomorphism
Yes.
in our theology.
Yeah. So on pages 306 to 308, in a sense, he was doing the ontology of reciprocity, relational being, and now we're dealing with epistemology. How do we read onto God? And we can't do it through a reading of ourselves onto God. That's an epistemological mistake. Usually people go the opposite way, epistemology and then ontology, but here there is an ordering in the argument that goes in that direction. Is
Okay.
full objectivity possible? And the word full there, of course, is the interesting word. We know he's argued that objectivity is possible, but does he really mean full there? What do we mean by full objectivity?
I think he's really hitting here on exactly what Ken was talking about earlier, the combination of objectivity and subjectivity. And if you don't have both poles, you don't have either one.
Either one.
And I love love the challenge that he raises here, that if theological science is being practiced in a faithful manner, then one of the signs of that ought to be that it has something to offer the fields of science that involve a human component, so that they don't have to settle for a false objectivity, that they can achieve an objectivity that is full in the sense of being holistic, both subjective and objective together. And Marty, this is why we need more of your work on McMurray and personalism.
First, I have to finish the 12.
Well, I think that's a great example. You're in a position to show a unique example that Torrance is calling for in these pages of theology gifting methods to fields of science that have this, that need this fuller conception of objectivity.
Yeah. And to
Theology.
say psychology I think Torrance had a problem with psychology because it does reduce the human to a particular lens that objectifies and doesn't see the person. And so to say the nature of the social coefficient of our being, to say who we are in Christ, who we are formed in our families, that all of the relational dimensions are an appropriate way for the social sciences to pay attention to the particularities. Yes, there are generalities of, yes, you're a human, and yes, you had a biological family, maybe, but it might be different, every one of them different. And the word normal just doesn't work really for anybody because there isn't one. So let's just get the particularity within the conversation and to recognize if you leave out the person of Christ, there is something foundationally missing about who you are as a person, known as a loved being who has a context of meaning that shapes who we are. And that's the joy we have to share with the world, that meaning is something that is gifted to us and it makes a difference in everything. So next week, I will be leading our discussion. You have just the title of it there, The Relevance of Historical Sciences, with the pages. You also did more extensive on 337 to 352 as a bit of a discussion with a whole bunch of footnotes.
No, I didn't do anything on that. Okay. The paragraph under that is just explaining the pages that follow, that they're just supplement. They're
and so my question is, how would you like somebody who is going to look at the rest of these? What was your intention for us to gain from the rest of the pages that were included in this handout?
Oh, I included them because twice Torrance used the phrase bracketed that has caused so much confusion in writing about Torrance.
Okay.
And since so that whole idea of bracketing being a word that for Torrance signals to me, when I see that word, he's thinking about the stratified relations of sciences.
Okay.
That simple point is all I was trying to illustrate, just because people tend to interpret bracketing as either natural theology in Torrance, that he's being inconsistent, or they interpret it as advocating methodological naturalism. And both of those, I think, are mistaken readings. Every time Torrance uses the word bracketed, I think he's talking about sciences in relationship to each other. And one of the examples is, how astronomy can complete geology when geology is talking about something that turns out to have been an asteroid event.
Right.
Well,
so one other question for you.
Completes geology, but it's not saying geology it needs faith it is a bridge to faith. It's right. So
it's a bridge to understanding the world. Yes. So I've been asked the question again as to whether or not Torrance's biography, that he wrote, is going to become available. That handout that you've been getting permission for.
Itinerarium Mentis. Yeah, we'll get it eventually from Bob. I talked to him recently about it, and he can't find it. As soon as he finds it, he's going to give it to us.
Okay, good.
But if you can get it from another, if you can get it from another source with permission to share it, great. Bob will give permission to share it, but
Well, I will wait because I don't know anybody else that has it. So we'll wait for that.
It's so
well,
frustrating not having that available.
yeah, I have a few weeks before we get to, I'll be doing next week, and then Jerome is going to be 3 weeks after that. So I'm looking at the 2 chapters out of Facets. What's the title of that book?
Facets of Faith and Science. Maybe I can't
Yes, so
remember.
there's 2 chapters in there that Torrance did, and that was the conference that you met
Yeah.
him and all that.
Oh,
So
those are so good. Yeah.
so I'm looking at 2 weeks of that in between while we wait for that final section of chapter 6.
Wow.
Because I think it adds to, it doesn't duplicate, I think it adds to the conversation.
Yeah.
And that would have been in what year that he did that?
Oh, early 90s, like 90,
So
92, 93. Yeah.
it's a more developed picture of Torrance at that point with some
Right.
really keynote
Right.
pieces.
And
So
a conference where he was in dialogue with a lot of people who are
Yeah.
present. So major writers, not only theologians, but philosophers of science,
yeah,
historians of science as well. So a truly interdisciplinary conference.
yeah,
And he was one historian of science was given 2 plenaries, one philosopher of science was given 2 plenaries, one theologian was given 2 plenaries. That was Torrance. Pretty amazing that he was in the center of the dialogue of that interdisciplinary conference.
absolutely. Good. So we'll
And
look at those.
another interesting thing about it was the papers were distributed in advance, so people came having read them already, ready, primed for discussion. That's
Awesome.
a pretty cool way to run a conference.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good. Well, I just want to trace the coming weeks here, and to say we have good things in store, and there are things we'll still wait for. And once we finish with Jerome, we'll be picking up into Karl Barth via TF Torrance to understand both of them better. But Kerry, thank you so much for wonderful handouts, wonderful conversation. The depth of wisdom you bring is just wonderful. So
Thanks, you all. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for all your input. And Marty, a final link for you before you leave Princeton. Tino's Artisan Pizza. Gotta try that.
Okay. We will check that out then.
All right.
Okay, and I think I have to get it before I close this or it goes away. Is that true?
Yeah, probably so. All right.
So many
Take care,
buttons to
everyone.
push in.
I hope
Okay.
that works.
Yes, well, I'm trying to get the chat to come up. I've got my AI companion going. Maybe I need to stop the AI companion.
Oh, I'll send you this link elsewhere by other
Okay.
means.
Okay, very good. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
All right. Bye-bye.
Blessings on you. Bye-bye.